The morning Lydia Brooks rode into Barlow Creek with fire in her eyes and a leather satchel full of receipts on her saddle, every soul on the main street knew that somebody was about to have the worst day of their life. Lydia was 26 years old, brown-haired and sharp-eyed, with the kind of jaw that had been set against the world since her father died and left her to figure out what had become of his money. She was not the sort of woman who wept quietly into a handkerchief. She was the sort of woman who organized her grief into ledger columns and rode 40 miles across the Texas plain in the August heat of 1882 to get answers she should have had 2 years ago. Her father, Thomas Brooks, had been a cattle broker operating out of San Antonio. When he passed from a fever in the winter of 1880, he left behind a modest house, a stack of debts that made Lydia's head swim, and references in his own private journals to a business arrangement with a rancher north of the Medina River by the name of Henry Barlow. According to her father's notes, Barlow owed the Brooks estate somewhere close to $4,000, a sum that represented, in the plainest terms, the difference between Lydia losing her home or keeping it. For 2 years she had written letters. Polite letters, firm letters, and finally one letter that she was not entirely proud of, but which had contained a number of very accurate observations about men who ignored their financial obligations. None of them had received a reply, and so she had packed her satchel, arranged for her neighbor Mrs. Callahan to look after the house, hired a horse from the livery stable, and ridden north. Barlow Creek was a small town, a general store, a saloon called the Blue Sage, a post office with a warped door, a blacksmith, and a scattering of homes along a single unpaved street that turned to orange mud when it rained. Lydia pulled her horse to a stop in front of the general store and asked the man sweeping the porch where she might find the Barlow Ranch. He pointed west without looking up. 3 miles out that road. Can't miss it. Got a painted gate post with a bee on it. Thank you, Lydia said, and she rode on. She found the gate post exactly where the man had said. The bee was painted in faded red, and the ranch road beyond it curved between 2 hills covered in dry summer grass. As she rode up the lane, she took in the property with the careful eye of a woman who had grown up, helping her father assess the creditworthiness of cattle operations. The fences were well maintained and recently repaired in several spots. The pastures on either side held healthy stock. She counted 24 head of longhorns visible from the road alone, and they looked well-fed and calm. The grass had been managed. The water trough near the first fence line was full and clean. Whatever Henry Barlow was, he was not a failing rancher. That fact made the absence of his replies to her letters all the more infuriating. The main house came into view as she crested the second hill. It was a solid, single-story structure built of limestone and cedar, with a wide covered porch running along the front and a stone chimney at either end. It was not fancy, but it was well kept. The yard was swept. There were chairs on the porch, a water basin near the door, and a dog lying in a patch of shade who lifted his head to look at her without much urgency. There was a man at the corral fence some 30 yards to the left of the house. He was watching her ride up with his arms resting on the top rail, one boot up on the lower one, the brim of a battered brown hat shading most of his face. He did not move to greet her, just watched, which Lydia found immediately aggravating. She rode close enough that she would not have to shout, then stopped her horse and looked at him directly. "I am looking for Henry Barlow," she said. "You found him," said the man. He was somewhere in his early 30s, she judged perhaps 32 or 33, lean but broad-shouldered with the kind of tan that came from years of outdoor work rather than a single summer's effort. He had dark eyes under that hat brim and a jaw that carried a few days of stubble. He was not unhandsome. She filed that observation away in a drawer she had no intention of opening. "I am Lydia Brooks," she said. "My father was Thomas Brooks of San Antonio. He was a cattle broker who conducted business with you beginning in the spring of 1879. You owe his estate a sum of approximately $4,000, and I have ridden 40 miles in this heat to collect it. Henry Barlow looked at her for a moment. Then he pushed back from the fence and straightened up, and she could see that he was taller than she had initially registered, well over 6 feet, with a comfortable economy of movement that suggested he was not a man easily startled. "Miss Brooks," he said, and his voice was low and measured, "I have been expecting you." That stopped her. Whatever she had prepared herself for argument, denial, delay, and outright refusal, she had not prepared herself for that. "You have been expecting me," she repeated. "I have," he said. He reached up and adjusted the brim of his hat. "Would you like to come inside? It is hot, and what I have to show you is going to take some time to go through properly." Lydia straightened in the saddle. "What you have to show me?" "Yes, ma'am." She studied him for a long moment, looking for the particular quality of a liar getting ready to perform, but she could not find it on his face. There was something else there instead, something that looked almost like relief. "All right," she said carefully. Henry called over a young ranch hand named Pete, who appeared from the direction of the barn with straw in his hair, and asked him to take Lydia's horse and see that it was watered and put in the shade. "Yes, sir, Mr. Barlow," Pete said, taking the reins and leading the horse away with a respectful nod to Lydia. Henry held open the door of the house, and Lydia walked in ahead of him, keeping her satchel close. The interior was what she might have expected from a working ranch house: functional, clean, with a long wooden table in the main room, a fireplace that smelled of ash and pine, a set of shelves holding supplies and tools, and a corner that served as an office space. There was a roll-top desk against the far wall, and on the kitchen table someone had already laid out a row of leather-bound ledgers that looked as though they had been placed there deliberately, not accidentally. The sight of them gave Lydia a peculiar feeling in her chest. "Have a seat," Henry said, moving toward the table. "Can I get you some water? I have cold water in the larder." "Please," Lydia said, because it had in fact been a very long, very hot ride and she was not made of stone. He brought her a tin cup of water that was genuinely cold and set it in front of her without ceremony. Then he settled into the chair across from her and laid his hat on the table beside him, and she could see his face properly for the first time. He looked, she thought, like a man carrying something. Not dishonest, there was nothing slippery in his eyes, but there was a weight behind them that she recognized because she had worn something similar herself for the past 2 years. "Before I show you these," Henry said, resting one hand on the ledgers, "I want you to know something. I did not answer your letters." "I am aware," Lydia said. "I should have," he said. "That was wrong of me. I am not going to offer you an excuse for it that would satisfy you because there isn't one." Lydia set her cup down slowly. "Then why didn't you?" He was quiet for a moment. "Because I was ashamed," he said, "and because what I needed to tell you was the kind of thing that is very hard to put in a letter without sounding like a man making excuses. I needed to be able to show you, not just say it." Lydia looked at the ledgers. "Then show me," she said. Henry opened the first ledger. What he showed her, over the next hour, was a complete and meticulous accounting of every transaction between himself and her father going back to April of 1879. Thomas Brooks had brokered the sale of Barlow cattle to a buyer in Galveston, 3 separate drives over the course of 2 years, totaling, as Henry showed her, a gross sale value that far exceeded what her father had recorded in his private journals. "The discrepancy," Henry said, turning to a page in the second ledger, "is here. Your father's notes record a smaller sum because the original Galveston buyer fell through in the second transaction. I found a replacement buyer in Corpus Christi, a man named Avery, at a significantly higher price per head. Your father's journals would not have reflected that because I had not yet sent him the final accounting when he became ill." Lydia studied the figures. They were detailed, cross-referenced, and signed at several points by a third party she did not recognize. "Who is this signature?" she asked, pointing. "A bank agent out of San Antonio named Caldwell," Henry said. "He verified the transactions. I have a letter from him as well." He reached across the table and produced a folded paper from beneath the ledgers that looked to have been there waiting for exactly this question. Lydia read it. It was dated the previous November, and it confirmed the figures Henry had shown her, with the bank's seal at the bottom. She turned to the third ledger. The third ledger was the one she had not expected. It was thinner than the others, and when Henry opened it, the first page held not rows of numbers but a single column of dated entries, written in a hand that was careful and unhurried. Each entry corresponded to a payment, not from Henry to her father, but from Henry into an account he had established at the San Antonio Savings and Loan in the name of the Brooks estate. He had been paying it, all of it. Quietly, without any letter to her, without any notification, month-by-month deposits beginning in the summer of 1881, 8 months after her father's death. "I did not know how to reach you directly," Henry said quietly. "Your father's letters came from a business address that was no longer operative after he passed. I made inquiries and I was told the estate was being handled through a lawyer named Pickens. Pickens died in February of 1881, Lydia said slowly. The practice dissolved. I found that out in October of that year, Henry said. By then I had already made 3 deposits and had no confirmation any of them were reaching anyone. I was not willing to stop paying. But I did not know how to find you." Lydia stared at the ledger. The numbers were there, clear and undeniable, and they added up to something very close to full payment. Not quite. There was a remaining balance she could calculate in her head, but the deposits represented a sincere and sustained effort that she had known nothing about. "You have been paying into this account for over a year," she said. "Yes." "Without knowing if it was reaching anyone." "Yes." "And you did not think to ride to San Antonio and find out." He was quiet for a moment, and she saw something shift in his expression, a kind of honest discomfort that she believed was real. "I thought about it," he said. "I should have done it sooner. There was a problem with the herd in the spring of last year. A disease swept through, and I lost a significant number of cattle. I was trying to keep this ranch operating, and I was not as decisive about the other matter as I should have been." Lydia sat back and looked at him. He was not trying to charm her. He was not using the kind of smooth, practiced language that a dishonest man employs when he has been caught. He was just sitting there across from her, his dark eyes steady and his hands quiet on the table, telling her the truth because it was what there was to tell. "What is the remaining balance?" she asked, pulling her voice back to the practical. He told her. It was approximately $600 short of the full $4,000. "I have it," he said. "Not in coin I can hand you today, but I can have it to you within 60 days. I would like to put that in writing if you are willing." Lydia reached into her satchel and pulled out her own accounting, the figures she had assembled from her father's journals, from letters, from every scrap of documentation she had been able to find. She laid them on the table beside his ledgers and began comparing, column by column, figure by figure. Henry watched her work without speaking. He got up once to refill her water cup without being asked and set it near her without comment, then returned to his chair. It took her the better part of another hour. By the end, she had found no significant discrepancy that favored anyone in a dishonest direction. The numbers were what he said they were. The payments had been made. The remaining balance was real but manageable, and his offer to have it to her in 60 days was not unreasonable given what she now knew about the losses he had sustained. She stacked her papers carefully and put them back in her satchel. "You said there was one more page," she said, because she had counted the ledger pages and there had been one at the back of the third book that he had not turned to. Henry looked at her with the kind of expression she would spend a long time afterward turning over in her mind. He reached across and turned to that last page slowly, as though he had been deciding right up until this moment whether he actually wanted her to see it. It was not a ledger page at all. It was a letter, written in his hand, addressed to Miss Lydia Brooks, and it was dated 3 months ago. It had never been sent. She read it. It was not what she had expected from a man she had come out here to confront. It was not defensive, and it was not apologetic in the clumsy way of a man trying to avoid consequences. It was honest in a way that made her chest tighten. He had written about her father, about what Thomas Brooks had been like as a man to do business with, his humor and his directness and his fairness. He had written that losing a fair man in a business world that was full of unfair ones had been its own kind of loss. He had written that he wished he had done better by the man's daughter. And at the end, in a single plain sentence that Lydia read 3 times before she set the page down, he had written, "I do not know what kind of woman you are, but if you are anything like your father, you deserve better than silence from a man who owes you more than money." The room was very quiet. Outside, she could hear the distant low of cattle and the soft movement of a warm wind against the porch timbers. "Why didn't you send it?" she asked. Henry had his hands flat on the table and he was looking at them. "Because it felt like the kind of thing a person needs to say in a room, not in a letter." Lydia looked at the letter for another moment and then carefully placed it back in the ledger and closed the cover. "I will need that 60-day arrangement in writing," she said, "with specific dates." "Yes," Henry said, "and I will need the account information for the San Antonio Bank so I can confirm the deposits that have already been made." "I will write all of that down for you before you leave," she nodded. "Then I think we understand each other." She had intended that to be the end of it. She had ridden out here to get answers and she had them, and the rational thing to do was to take the signed agreement, ride back to Barlow Creek, find a room for the night and start home in the morning. That was what she had planned. What she had not planned was Henry Barlow pushing his chair back from the table and saying, with the careful manner of a man who has been alone in his own company for too long and knows it, "You have ridden 40 miles in August heat, and I have a roast in the oven that will be done within the hour. I would consider it an honor if you would stay for supper." Lydia looked at him. He was not being unctuous. He was not leveraging the meal as a negotiation tactic. He was simply a man sitting in a house that had all the signs of being quietly solitary, one chair habitually used by the fire, one coffee cup on the hook, a kitchen that was functional but held no evidence of anyone other than himself. And he was, with the plainest possible delivery, asking her not to leave immediately. "All right," she said. "Thank you." Henry nodded once, as though the matter had been settled, and went to check on the roast. She used the time to examine the room more carefully with the frank curiosity she usually suppressed when other people were watching. There were books on a shelf near the desk, not decorative books but read books, with worn spines and pages that had been turned many times. A Bible, but also a surveying manual, a history of the Texas territory, and a thin volume of poetry by Whitman that surprised her considerably. There was a framed photograph on the desk of a man and woman she didn't recognize, older and formal in the style of early portrait photographs. His parents, she assumed. She walked to the doorway of the kitchen, where Henry was moving around with the same quiet economy of motion she had noticed at the corral. "Do you need help?" she asked. He looked over his shoulder and seemed surprised, as though help had not been something he thought to offer or request. "Can you cut bread without injury? I was managing a household at 16, she said. "I think I can manage bread." He tilted his head toward the bread board on the counter and turned back to the stove. They worked together in the kitchen in silence that was not uncomfortable, which Lydia noticed with a small portion of herself that she was not giving too much attention. She found the plates without asking. They were where you would logically keep plates, and she set the table, and when Henry put the food out, they sat down across from each other in the natural way of two people who had somehow skipped several stages of unfamiliarity without meaning to. The roast was good. There were beans alongside it and cornbread that he had made himself, and she told him it was a fine meal because it was, and because she had been raised to acknowledge things that deserved acknowledgement. "Your father mentioned you in letters," Henry said at some point during the meal. Lydia looked up. "Did he?" "He said his daughter had a better head for numbers than any man he had ever hired." Henry said this without particular emphasis, as a plain fact, meeting her eyes. He said it in the same tone a man uses when he is very proud of something but does not feel the need to announce it. Lydia was quiet for a moment. "He never said that to me directly. Men of his generation often didn't." No, she agreed. They often didn't. She looked at her plate. The grief she had been carrying for 2 years had a different shape in this room than it did anywhere else, and she was not entirely sure what to do with that. He also said, Henry continued carefully, that you had been running his books since you were 17 and that he did not know what he would do without you and that he intended to tell you so. The tightness in Lydia's chest came back sharper this time. He did not have time, she said. No, Henry said. He didn't. The silence that followed was the kind that does not need to be filled. After supper, they sat on the porch as the sun went low over the western hills and painted everything in shades of copper and dark gold that were particular to Texas evenings in late summer. The heat had broken with the sun, and a breeze had come in from the south that moved the dry grass in long, gentle waves across the pastures. Henry brought 2 cups of coffee and sat in the other porch chair without asking permission, which Lydia found she did not mind, and they watched the evening come in while the dog, whose name turned out to be Luther, settled himself between their chairs with a sigh of supreme contentment. "How many head do you run?" Lydia asked after a while. "About 350 this season," Henry said. "I was at nearly 400 before the illness last spring." "Are you recovering?" He nodded slowly. "Slower than I would like. I had to take out a short loan from the Barlow Creek Bank to manage feed costs through last winter. That is part of why the remaining 600 was not in the account already. It will be by October, once I sell the fall calves." Lydia thought about the figures. They held together logically with what she had seen in the ledgers. "The Corpus Christi buyer, Avery, is he still active?" Henry glanced at her with what might have been the beginning of a smile. "He is." "You want to know if my buyer relationships are sound. You just told me you owe me $600 and I am trying to assess whether October is realistic," she said crisply. And he did smile then, a proper one, which changed his face in a way she filed in the same drawer she was not opening. "Avery has been reliable for 3 seasons, Henry said. "His operation has expanded. He will take more cattle than I can currently supply." "Then October is realistic," Lydia said, and returned her attention to the horizon. Pete, the ranch hand, walked past the porch on his way to the bunkhouse and touched his hat to both of them. A moment later, a second young man followed, broader, quieter, who nodded without speaking. "How many hands do you employ?" Lydia asked. 3 full-time, Henry said. "Pete, Domingo, and a man named Cal who is out at the north pasture fence today. I hire additional help for drives. And you manage the books yourself." "I do, clearly," she said, and there was something in her voice that was close to respect, though she was not certain she meant it to be audible. Henry looked at her. "You sound surprised. Most ranchers I have dealt with through my father's business kept terrible books." "My father was a careful man," Henry said. "He taught me that the only way to know whether you are ahead or behind is to know every number exactly. He said a man who guesses at his own finances is a man who is planning to fail slowly." Lydia turned to look at him fully for the first time since they had sat down, and she found that he was already looking at her, calmly and directly, without any of the performance of a man trying to make an impression. "That is almost exactly what my father used to say," she said. "Then perhaps," Henry said, "they were both right." She held his gaze for a moment longer than she had intended, then turned back to the darkening sky. The first stars were beginning to show above the eastern hills. Luther shifted between their chairs and put his head on Henry's boot. "I should not ride back to town tonight," Lydia said practically. "It is too dark now and I do not know this road well enough." "No," Henry said. "I would not let you anyway. The spare room is made up. It was my sister's when she visited and the sheets are clean." There was nothing inappropriate in how he said it. There was a spare room and he was offering it, and that was the entirety of the matter, and Lydia appreciated that there was nothing complicated behind it. "Thank you," she said. "In the morning I would like to get that written agreement before I leave." "I will have it ready at breakfast," he said. She stood and took her empty coffee cup inside, and Henry showed her down the short hall to the spare room, which was small and tidy with a window that looked out on the south pasture. He lit the lamp for her and left it on the bedside table. "Good night, Miss Brooks," he said from the doorway. "Good night, Mr. Barlow," she said. He closed the door quietly, and she sat on the edge of the bed in the lamplight for a long while before she lay down, listening to the nighttime sounds of the ranch, the cattle moving in the dark distance, Luther settling himself somewhere near the door, the wind in the grass, and thinking about an unsent letter and what it meant that a man had written it. She did not come to any conclusions that night, but she slept better than she had in several months. In the morning, the ranch was already active when she woke. She could hear movement in the kitchen, and when she came down the hall she found Henry at the stove with coffee already made and eggs in a pan, and the written agreement on the table beside two plates with a pen laid across it. She read it carefully. She was not a woman who signed anything without reading it, and found it clear and complete, with the specific dates he had promised and a clause about what would happen if the date was not met, which she had not asked for but which he had included on his own. She signed it and he countersigned, and they each kept a copy. She had intended to leave directly after breakfast. What happened instead was that Pete came in with a problem. One of the breeding cows had gotten into a difficult situation with a fence line in the east pasture, and Henry was needed. And he said to Lydia, "I am sorry, this will not take long, please have more coffee," and went out with Pete. And Lydia poured herself more coffee and picked up the Whitman volume from the bookshelf because she was curious, and because she was in the habit of reading when she was waiting. When Henry came back 40 minutes later, he found her at the kitchen table with the book open and the coffee cold and a particular expression on her face that he spent a moment looking at before she noticed him. "Sorry," he said. "The cow?" she asked. "Fine. There's a calf that arrived early this morning that was not expected until next week." He was washing his hands at the basin near the door, his back to her. "First one of the season. Does that happen often, early arrivals?" "Often enough." He dried his hands and turned around. "How is Whitman?" "I have always found him more interesting than most people give him credit for," she said. "He has a way of saying plain things so that they hit harder than you expect them to," Henry said. "Yes," Lydia agreed. "That is exactly it." She looked at the book for a moment, then set it carefully back on the shelf where she had found it. "I should go," she said. "I know," he said. She collected her satchel and he walked out with her to where Pete had her horse ready. The morning was still cool, the kind of clear blue Texas morning that almost made you forget how ferocious the afternoon would be, and the air smelled of grass and cedar and the particular dry sweetness of ranch country. Henry checked the saddle girth himself without commentary, then stepped back. "Miss Brooks," he said, "I want to say one more thing." Lydia, with her foot in the stirrup, paused and looked down at him. "I am sorry I did not come find you sooner," he said. "Not just about the money. I had your father's address in my ledger and I knew about his death 3 weeks after it happened, and I should have written to you then. Not about business. Just because it was the right thing to do. Because he was a good man and you were alone and someone who knew him should have said something." Lydia held herself very still on the horse. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. Henry looked up at her with those steady dark eyes. "Because you came 40 miles to demand an accounting," he said. "And you deserve a full one." She held his gaze. The morning was very bright and very quiet around them. 60 days, Mr. Barlow," she said finally. "Yes, ma'am," he said. "You have my word." She rode back to Barlow Creek, caught the eastbound stage, and did not think about Henry Barlow more than 6 or 7 times on the way home. She told herself this was a reasonable number. She was wrong, of course. She thought about him considerably more than that, but she was the kind of woman who applied a discount to her own admissions on certain subjects, so she let herself believe 6 or 7 and moved on. Back in San Antonio, she confirmed the deposits at the bank. Everyone was there exactly as he had described, entered with a simple reference notation that read BB Estate in the bank's register. The clerk showed her the record, and she stood at the bank counter looking at it for a moment longer than necessary, then thanked him and walked out into the afternoon heat of the city. The house on Birch Street, her father's house, now hers, the one she was fighting to keep needed work. The porch rail on the east side had rotted through, and the kitchen had a leak that had been getting worse since spring, and the property tax was due in October. The $600 she was expecting from Henry in the fall would cover the tax and most of the repairs, which was exactly what she needed it to do. She set herself to managing the house and managing her finances with the same disciplined attention she always gave her affairs, and she told herself she was satisfied with the resolution of the Barlow matter. She was also wrong about that. 3 weeks after her visit, a letter arrived. It was not about the payment schedule or the ledgers or any business matter at all. It was from Henry Barlow, and it said, "Miss Brooks, I have been thinking about what you said about Whitman. I believe you were right that he is underestimated. I have read him more carefully since you left, and I find that I agree with you more than I initially expected to. I hope the road home was not too difficult. I hope you are well. H. Barlow." Lydia read this letter twice, set it down, picked it up and read it again, then sat at her writing desk for 20 minutes before composing a response that took her 4 drafts and ultimately said, "Mr. Barlow, I was glad to find the road manageable. Thank you for asking." The poem, beginning with the words, "I exist as I am, that is enough," has always seemed to me the most honest sentence in the whole volume. "I am well. L. Brooks." She mailed it before she could change her mind about sending it. He wrote back within 10 days, which for a letter traveling between San Antonio and a small town west of the Medina River was about as fast as physically possible, and the letter was 3 paragraphs long, and the second paragraph contained a thought about honesty and accounting, about how the same discipline required to keep a ledger accurately is required to look at your own life honestly. That made Lydia sit back in her chair and look at the ceiling for a moment. They wrote. They wrote through September, the letters growing longer and less formal by careful degrees, in the way of 2 people who are both intelligent enough to know what is happening and both cautious enough not to name it directly. She told him about the house and the repairs she was managing. He told her about the fall preparation for the cattle drive and an early frost warning that had everyone anxious. She told him about the books she had been reading from the lending library, and about a dispute with a neighbor over a property line that she was handling through a lawyer, because she found the legal process more satisfying than direct argument. He wrote back, "I find direct argument more satisfying, but I think I would choose the approach that works, and you are clearly better at determining that than I am." She told herself that a statement of that kind from a man was simply courtesy. She told herself this with decreasing conviction as October arrived. On the 18th of October, the remaining $600 arrived in the bank. Lydia received the notification from the bank that same afternoon and spent a quiet hour in the kitchen with her accounting, finally clearing the last entry in the Brooks estate debt column and marking it settled in full. She should have felt purely relieved. She felt instead something complicated, because the payment being complete meant there was no longer any practical reason for a correspondence, and she had grown accustomed to letters arriving from the West that were more interesting than most things that arrived at her door. She sat at her writing desk for a long time that evening. Then she wrote, "Mr. Barlow, the bank notified me today of the final deposit. The account is settled in full. I wanted you to know, and to say that I found your handling of this matter to be honorable throughout, whatever the delays, and I respect that. I find myself at something of a loss for what follows from here, since the business between us is concluded. I have been uncertain whether to say so or whether to simply stop writing, since there is no longer a practical reason for it. But I was raised to say what I mean, so I am saying it. I do not know what we are now that the accounting is done. L. Brooks." She looked at it for a long time. Then she mailed it because she was not, when it came to it, a woman who left things unsaid. His reply took 11 days instead of 10, which was 1 day longer than usual, and which she did not notice herself tracking with any particular attention until the letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in late October, and she she realized, genuinely relieved to see it. She sat down to read it right there at the kitchen table before she had even taken off her coat. "Miss Brooks, I have read your letter more times than I am comfortable reporting. I do not know the answer to what you asked, but I believe I know what I want the answer to be, and I suspect you do too, or you would not have asked the question the way you asked it. What I am not willing to do is answer a question of that size in a letter, because you told me once that you were raised to say what you mean, and I was raised the same way, which means I should say this to you directly and not from 40 miles away on a page. I would like very much to see you again. If that is something you would consider, I am willing to come to San Antonio, or to meet you wherever it is convenient for you, or to meet you here, whichever seems right to you. Tell me what you want and I will make it happen. H. Barlow." Lydia put the letter down on the table. She sat for approximately 4 minutes, which was longer than she usually needed to make decisions. Then she wrote, "Come to San Antonio, Saturday the 5th if that suits you." He arrived on the 5th of November on the early stage, and she met him at the stage stop because she had not been willing to wait at home wondering whether he had come or not, and because she was honest enough with herself to admit that she wanted to see him walk off that stage. He came down the steps with his hat in one hand and a jacket over his arm, wearing a shirt that was clean and had been pressed. And when he saw her standing there on the boardwalk, he stopped for just a moment before he came toward her, and the expression on his face when he stopped was one she would keep with her for the rest of her life. "Miss Brooks," he said. "Mr. Barlow," she said, "welcome to San Antonio." They stood looking at each other in the bright November morning, and the distance between them felt like something that had been calculated and now needed to be revised. "You look well," he said. "You look like you pressed that shirt yourself and it shows in the back," she said. He laughed, a real laugh, not a polite one, and it arrived on his face like sun coming through cloud cover, and Lydia decided, clearly and irreversibly, that she was done talking herself out of things. She showed him the city. She had lived in San Antonio for most of her life, and she knew it with the particular intimacy of someone who has walked every street out of necessity rather than tourism, and she showed him things that mattered to her, the river, the market, the old Mission District, and explained them with the same directness she brought to everything. He listened with the same complete attention she had noticed in the ranch house, without the restlessness that most men showed when they were required to listen for extended periods. They had lunch at a small restaurant near the market where she knew the proprietress. They talked through the meal with the ease of people who have been writing to each other for 3 months and have already done much of the preliminary work. He asked her about her father's business, and she told him about it fully, including the parts that had been difficult, the debts, the dissolution of the practice, the 2 years of trying to hold things together. He listened without offering solutions or consoling platitudes, which was exactly what she needed from a listener. She asked him about the ranch, about his plans for it, about how he had come to be there. He had grown up there, his father had built the main house and established the operation, and Henry had taken it over at 24 when his father died of a stroke. He had a sister in Austin, married with 3 children. His mother had passed when he was 12. "You have been running that ranch alone for 8 years, she said. "Not entirely alone," he said. "Pete has been with me 6 years. "That is not what I mean," she said. He met her eyes. "I know," he said. "Yes, I have been running it alone." In the afternoon, they walked along the river, and the November air was cool, and the light came through the cottonwood trees in long autumn slants that turned everything gold. At some point, she could not have said exactly when, he had offered his arm and she had taken it, and they were walking close together in the easy way of people who have reached an understanding without having formally stated it. "I would like to come back," he said as they stood at the river's edge and watched the water move. "If you would have me." "I would have you," she said, and the words were simple and plain and carried everything she meant by them. He looked at her, and then he reached over and took her free hand very carefully, as though it was something he had been deciding whether to do for quite a long time, and held it in both of his. "I am not a man who moves quickly," he said. "On personal matters, I want to be honest with you about that." "I know," she said. "It took you a year and a half to mail a letter." He winced slightly. "That is a fair point." "I am not criticizing," she said. "I am telling you I have already figured that out and I am still here." He looked at her for a long moment in the golden afternoon light. "Then I would like to court you," he said, "properly, with your permission. I would like to come to San Antonio when I can and write when I cannot, and I would like to know you better than I do." Lydia stood at the edge of the river in the autumn light and looked at this man who had kept her father's money honest and her father's memory honorable, who had kept an unsent letter in his ledger like something he was waiting to be brave enough for, who had ridden 40 miles in letters when he could not ride in person, and she felt the thing in her chest that she had been trying to name for 3 months settle into a shape she recognized. "Yes," she said, "I would like that very much." He squeezed her hand once briefly, and then they stood there in the afternoon in a companionable and hopeful quiet, and she thought that she had ridden out to Barlow Creek to demand an accounting, and had received one she had not expected in several different ways, and that she was not in the least sorry about any of it. He came back 2 weeks later. He came back in December. He spent Christmas in San Antonio, and they had dinner at Lydia's house, which was the first time a man other than a repair worker had been inside it since her father died, and she cooked a proper meal, and he brought wine from a general store in Barlow Creek that he had been very deliberate about selecting, and they spent the evening talking by the fireplace until it was late and the street outside was quiet. He left on the 26th, and she stood at the front door watching him go down Birch Street in the dark, with his coat collar up against the December cold, and she thought that the house felt notably different when he was not in it. In January, he wrote less frequently because the ranch was in the grip of a difficult winter. An ice storm had come through and damaged fences across a wide section of the north pasture, and he and his hands were working long days to keep the herd from losing ground. But the letters that came were honest about that and also about other things, and one of them, arriving on a cold Thursday morning, said, "I find myself thinking about you at odd moments. Not just about the correspondence, but about the particular way you look at things, like everything needs to be accounted for, and also like you find accounts genuinely interesting, which is a combination I have never encountered before. I am sorry this letter is shorter than usual. The fence is not going to repair itself." Lydia smiled at that letter in a way she did not bother to account for. In February, she rode up to the ranch for the first time since August. She had told herself she was going because she wanted to see the operation in winter conditions and assess whether the October payment had been the result of genuine financial stability or an exceptional circumstance. She knew this was not the primary reason, but she told it to herself anyway because some habits take time to break. The ranch in winter was different from the ranch in August. The pastures were brown and the sky was wide and pale above them, and there was a smell to the air that was dry and cold and particular to the hill country in February. Henry came out to meet her when she rode up the lane, and there was none of the careful watchfulness of their first meeting. He just walked out to meet her the way a man walks out to meet someone he is glad to see. "You came," he said. "I said I would," she said. He helped her down from the horse with a hand that lingered briefly at her elbow, and she let it. Pete greeted her warmly, and with the comfortable familiarity of someone who had heard her name mentioned a significant number of times. Domingo touched his hat and said good morning with a quiet dignity. Cal, the third hand, nodded from a distance and returned to his work. They were good men, she thought, the kind of men a fair employer keeps and a poor one loses. She stayed 3 days that time. She helped Henry with the accounts, not because he needed help, but because he mentioned that reconciling the quarterly figures was a particular chore, and she had offered before she thought better of it, and he had looked at her with an expression she was learning to read as something close to delight and said, "Would you?" They worked at the kitchen table in the evenings after supper, the lamp between them, and it was the most natural thing she had done in years, sitting across from a man with a set of ledgers and finding the work genuinely pleasurable. They argued about one entry, a feed cost allocation that she thought he had categorized incorrectly, and he maintained was accurate, and went back and forth about it with the kind of specific, detailed debate that both of them found considerably more enjoyable than they would have been willing to openly admit. He was right, ultimately. She found the original receipt that proved his categorization. She acknowledged this with the full weight of her professional respect, which was the kind of acknowledgment she did not give lightly, and Henry received it with a small, private smile that she found extremely irritating in the most agreeable possible way. On the last evening, they sat on the porch with coffee, even though it was cold, because neither of them was quite willing to go inside and end the evening. Luther was on Henry's feet. The winter stars were enormous over the open country, the kind of sky you did not see from San Antonio. "I want to ask you something," Henry said. "All right," Lydia said. He was quiet for a moment, in the way of a man choosing words carefully. "I'm not going to make this something it isn't," he said finally. "So I am going to say it plainly. I know we have been at this since November, and it has been the best part of my winter, of my year, if I am honest. And I want to know whether I am reading this correctly or whether I am building something in my own head that is not what you are seeing." Lydia looked at the stars. She let the question sit in the air for a moment that she might have been using to think, or might have been using to enjoy the fact that he had said it out loud. "You are reading it correctly," she said. Henry turned to look at her. He seemed to be deciding something. Then he reached over and took her hand the same careful way he had done it the first time at the river in November, and this time he did not let go after a moment. He held it. "Good," he said quietly. They sat like that in the February cold, with their coffee going cold in their other hands and the stars enormous above them, and Lydia thought that this was the kind of thing her father would have wanted for her if he had been given the time to say so. March brought better weather, and a letter that arrived at the Birch Street house on a Monday morning that Lydia had to read sitting down. It was not a long letter. Henry was not a man who circled around things when he had decided to speak directly, and the letter said, in the plainest possible terms, that he loved her and that he wanted to marry her if she would have him, and that he was prepared to come to San Antonio immediately to discuss this properly if she would allow him to, but that he had not been willing to wait for a visit to say the thing that needed saying because he was tired of waiting in general, and life was short, and he did not intend to spend any more of it not being clear about the things that mattered. He wrote that she deserved to know exactly where she stood with him, since she had come 40 miles to find out where she stood once before, and he did not intend to make her wait for important information again. Lydia sat at her kitchen table in the March morning light and held the letter in both hands and breathed very carefully. Then she went to her writing desk and wrote, "Come now, L. Brooks." He arrived 4 days later. She opened the door on a Thursday afternoon, and there he was on her porch in his good coat with his hat in his hands, and she looked at him for one long moment and then stepped back and said, "Come in." He asked her properly in the parlor, standing, with the kind of direct simplicity that was so entirely characteristic of him that she would have found anything else suspicious. He said that he loved her, and that he believed she was the most remarkable person he had met in his adult life, and that he wanted her to be his wife, and he asked. She said yes. She said it clearly and without hedging, and when she did, something happened to his face that she would spend the rest of her life being glad she had seen. A kind of release, as though a thing he had been holding very carefully for a long time had finally been set down. He crossed the space between them and held her face in his hands and kissed her, and she put her hands against his chest and kissed him back. And outside on Birch Street, the March afternoon went on peacefully, entirely indifferent to the fact that everything had just changed. They were married in San Antonio in May, in the small Methodist church on Commerce Street, where Lydia's father had been a member. It was a modest wedding. Lydia was not given to extravagance, and Henry would not have known what to do with it, but it was full. Henry's sister Ellen came from Austin with her husband Robert and their 3 children, filling out one side of the church with the particular cheerful chaos of a family that likes each other. Mrs. Callahan and several of Lydia's neighbors from Birch Street took up the other side. Pete came from the ranch and stood very straight in a clean suit that he had clearly obtained specifically for the occasion. And Domingo was there with his wife Maria, who brought flowers she had gathered herself and pressed into Lydia's hands at the church door with a warmth that bypassed every language barrier. Cal came too, quiet and clean-shaved, and stood in the back as though he was not sure he had the right to be there. And Lydia made a point of thanking him personally before the service, which made him go red to the ears and stand considerably straighter. Lydia wore a dress of pale blue wool that she had made herself. She was a practical seamstress, and she had made something beautiful with practicality as its backbone. And when Henry saw her come down the aisle, he went very still in the way she had come to recognize as his form of strong feeling, and she walked toward him with her chin up and her eyes on his, and the whole church seemed to go quiet, and the minister said the words, and they said their own. And Henry put a ring on her finger that had belonged to his mother, which she had known about because he had asked if she minded, and she had said she was honored, and that was that. She was Lydia Barlow, which felt strange for approximately 3 days and then felt right. They spent their first weeks as a married couple in San Antonio, because there were things to attend to. The house on Birch Street had to be let or sold, accounts had to be reorganized, and there was a farewell of sorts to the city that had been her home for all of her life. She sold the house, at a fair price, negotiated firmly, because she was her father's daughter and she knew what fair meant and packed what mattered and left what didn't. And on a warm morning in early June, she and Henry left San Antonio heading north and west, and she did not look back more than once. The ranch received her the way places receive people who belong in them, with no particular ceremony and a kind of simple rightness. Luther met her at the door with an enthusiasm that he had never shown Henry, which Henry noted with perfect equanimity. The spare room where she had slept on that first August night became her study, where she set up her writing desk and her books and the ledgers she brought from San Antonio, and the kitchen became partly hers and partly Henry's in the easy collaborative way they had discovered they both preferred. She took over the ranch accounts completely within a month, not because Henry was incapable, but because she was better at it and they both knew it. And Henry said so without any wounded pride whatsoever, which made her love him approximately 4% more than she already did, which was a considerable amount. She began to know the ranch the way she had known the house on Birch Street intimately, with the particular affection that comes from daily contact. She knew which fence section gave trouble in winter, and which pasture held the grass longest in a dry summer. She knew Pete's strengths and Domingo's habits and Cal's specific brand of silent usefulness. She learned the cattle, not all 350 by sight, but the personalities of the leading animals, the hierarchy of the herd, the subtle signals that indicated something was off. Henry watched her learn with an expression she caught occasionally when she turned around unexpectedly, and which she recognized as the same expression she had seen on his face at the stage stop, like a man watching something he could not quite believe was real and was quietly grateful for. She caught him watching her at the kitchen table one evening in late July when she was working through the quarterly accounts with her sleeves rolled up and her hair pinned back loosely, and she said without looking up, "What?" "Nothing," he said. "Henry," he smiled at his coffee cup, "I was thinking that your father was right." "About what specifically?" "That you had a better head for numbers than any man he had hired." She looked up then. He was looking back at her with those steady dark eyes, and the warmth in them was something she had still not entirely adjusted to, even after months. "He was right," she said. "He was," Henry agreed, without any irony at all. She threw a pencil at him. He caught it. In August, almost exactly a year after she had ridden up that lane with fire in her eyes and a leather satchel full of grievances, she told Henry that she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen after supper when the dishes were done and the evening was quiet. She said it plainly because that was how she said everything, and she watched him very carefully as she said it. Henry set down his cup. He looked at her. And then he crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and put his arms around her, very carefully and completely. And he held her there in the kitchen without saying anything for a long moment, and she could feel him breathing. "Well," he said into her hair. "Well indeed," she said. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am also terrified, which I think is probably standard." "I think so," he said, and tightened his arms slightly. "I am too." She turned her face into his shoulder and let herself be held, which was something she was still learning to do without her old instinct to manage everything at arm's length. Henry was patient about this in the particular way. He was patient about all things she was working through. He did not push. He did not mention it. He simply remained available in a steady and reliable way that she had come to trust absolutely. "It's going to be all right," he said quietly, which was not the most original thing anyone had ever said and which she believed completely. "Yes," she said, "it is." The pregnancy was not without its difficulties. The summer heat was brutal that year, and Lydia was not a woman who was willing to slow down simply because she was with child, which led to more than one firm but careful argument with Henry about what was reasonable exertion and what was not. She maintained that managing the accounts from the kitchen table was not unreasonable exertion, regardless of the temperature. He maintained that she should tell him if she needed anything instead of working through it silently. They both maintained their respective positions with total sincerity and no resolution, which Lydia found extremely characteristic of their marriage in general. She had her counterpart in Maria, Domingo's wife, who had 4 children and a direct manner, and who had taken to Lydia with a warmth that was comprehensive and unsubtle. Maria came to the house regularly, and they sat together in the afternoons when the heat was worst. And Maria's Spanish and Lydia's English met somewhere in the middle in a practical working language that served them both, and there was comfort in the company that Lydia accepted gratefully. Henry's sister Ellen came for 2 weeks in September, and Ellen was the kind of woman warm, forthright, and thoroughly opinionated, who Lydia found she liked immediately and without reservation. Ellen's opinion of Lydia, conveyed through a letter to Henry that he read aloud at the kitchen table with a running commentary, was that she was the best thing that had ever happened to the ranch and to him, in approximately that order, which was a specific ranking that Henry said he found very fair. The baby came in March, a boy, arriving in the early hours of a Tuesday morning with a great deal of efficiency and noise, as though he had somewhere to be. Lydia, who had managed the whole thing with a degree of composure that the midwife from Barlow Creek said she had never quite encountered before, held him in the gray pre-dawn and looked at his red, furious, perfect face, and felt something restructure itself inside her that she did not have words for. Henry sat beside her on the edge of the bed with his hand over hers, looking at the baby with an expression that was entirely unguarded in a way she had never quite seen him before. "Thomas," she said. She had not told him the name ahead of time. She watched him. Henry looked at her. His jaw moved. He nodded once decisively. "Thomas," he said. Thomas Henry Barlow was, from the first days, a very definite person. He had Lydia's dark eyes and Henry's jaw, and a disposition that made itself known with clarity on all subjects. He was loudly unhappy about things he objected to, and completely content about things he did not. And he had, from about 3 months old, the habit of watching everything that happened in a room with an attention that struck Lydia as extremely familiar. "He watches things the way you do," she told Henry. "You watch things the same way," Henry said. "He learned it from you," she said. "Or you," he said. "Both of us," she decided, and picked Thomas up and carried him out to the porch to show him the evening, which he regarded with appropriate gravity. Life on the ranch settled into a rhythm that had the particular quality of a life built rather than discovered, each element placed deliberately and held with care. Henry ran the cattle operation with the same methodical reliability she had identified in his ledgers on that first day, expanding the herd carefully as finances allowed, maintaining the buyer relationship with Avery in Corpus Christi, hiring an additional hand named James in the second year as the operation grew. Lydia managed the accounts and the household with her characteristic precision, and also began, slowly, to build something she had not expected to find in this place, a sense of community. Barlow Creek was small, but it was real, and the people in it were the kind of people who built places rather than just occupying them. She joined the small lending library group that met at the general store on Wednesday mornings, which was run by a woman named Clara Whitfield, who had an impressive collection of both books and opinions, and whom Lydia found completely agreeable. She developed a friendship with the local schoolteacher, a young man named Morrison who was 22 years old and trying to build a school curriculum with no funding and considerable ambition, and she helped him write 3 funding applications to the county and 1 to a church organization in Austin, 2 of which were successful. She became, without particularly trying, known in Barlow Creek as a woman whose advice on financial matters was worth seeking. People came to her with lease agreements, with farm accounts, with plans for businesses they wanted to understand before they committed to. She charged a small fee after Henry pointed out that people valued what they paid for, and she used the money to supplement the school fund, which Morrison was about to run short on anyway. Henry watched all of this with the same quiet pride she had seen in him since November in San Antonio, and which she had largely stopped being disconcerted by and had begun instead to receive in the full spirit in which it was offered. 2 years after Thomas was born, they were sitting at the kitchen table on a winter evening, Thomas asleep, Henry reviewing a letter from Avery about next season's prices, Lydia working through the spring planting budget for the kitchen garden she had established on the south side of the house, when Henry looked up and said, without particular preamble, "Are you happy here?" Lydia looked up from her figures. "Yes," she said. She did not feel the need to qualify it. "Good," he said, and went back to the Avery letter. She watched him for a moment. Then she said, "Are you?" He looked up with that small private smile that was one of the things she most reliably loved about him. "Unreasonably so," he said. She returned to her figures. The fire was warm. Outside, the winter stars were doing what they always did over this particular stretch of Texas hill country, performing magnificently, with no audience required. In the spring of 1886, 4 years after Lydia had first ridden up that lane, they had their second child. A girl this time, Clara Ellen Barlow, named partly for Lydia's friend from the lending library and partly for Henry's sister, which made both of those women very pleased and more than a little competitive about which of them deserved the honor more. Clara arrived with considerably less noise than Thomas had, opened her eyes immediately, and looked around the room with the expression of someone who has arrived somewhere and is assessing whether it will do. "She has your face," Henry said, holding her in the kitchen doorway so the morning light fell on her. "She has your calm," Lydia said. "Thomas has my noise." Henry laughed. "Thomas has both our determination pointed in different directions." "He does," Lydia agreed, which was the most diplomatic thing anyone had said about Thomas Barlow since he had turned 3 and discovered that opinions were something you could express at significant volume. Thomas, confronted with his sister, considered her seriously for a long moment and then declared that she was acceptable, which was his highest available form of praise, and which everyone in the household received with great relief. Life continued to expand in the way of a life that is being genuinely lived. The ranch grew steadily. Henry hired a second additional hand and built a larger bunkhouse to accommodate them, which Lydia helped design insofar as she had strong opinions about where things should go, and Henry had learned to incorporate these opinions into his plans from the beginning rather than after the fact, which saved considerable time. Pete, now into his fourth decade and showing the beginnings of gray at his temples, had become such a fixed feature of the operation that Thomas called him Uncle Pete without anyone suggesting this, and Clara followed suit before she could fully manage the word, producing something closer to Uncle Pete, which Pete found extremely satisfying. In the fall of 1887, a matter arose that required Lydia's particular skills. A rancher north of Barlow Creek, a man named Draper who ran a considerably larger operation than Henry, had been slow paying a number of local suppliers and had, it emerged through a series of conversations at the lending library and the general store, taken out loans against property that several of Barlow Creek's residents had believed to be clear. Lydia became aware of this through Clara Whitfield, who had a cousin with a lien on a piece of equipment that Draper claimed to have paid for. It was not violence and it was not dramatic, but it was real harm to real people, and Lydia spent 3 weeks quietly gathering information, reviewing documents that people brought her, and writing a very detailed, very accurate letter to the county land office and the Medina County Circuit Court about the situation, supported by documentation that was, as the county assessor later commented, the most organized financial complaint he had received in 11 years of service. Draper ultimately settled most of his obligations to avoid the attention the letter had generated, and while justice of this kind was slow and incomplete, and not everything that Lydia would have wanted, it was something, and the people who had been owed money received most of it, and Clara Whitfield's cousin recovered his equipment. Henry, hearing about this after the fact because Lydia had not wanted to worry him with something she could handle herself, listened to the whole account at the kitchen table with his coffee, and then looked at her with an expression that was both proud and somewhat rueful. "You did all of this without telling me," he said. "I did not need your help with it," she said. "I needed the county assessor's help." "That is not why I mention it," he said. She looked at him. "I mention it," he said, "because you could have told me, not for help, just because it was happening." Lydia sat with that for a moment. It was a fair point, and she knew it. "I am accustomed to managing things alone," she said. "I know," Henry said. "You have been doing it since you were 17. "Yes," she said. "You don't have to anymore," he said, simply and without accusation. It was one of the most significant things he had ever said to her, which she recognized at the time and even more so afterward. She had been alone in a real sense for a long time before Henry, and the habits of that aloneness had roots that went down further than she sometimes remembered. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. "I know," she said. "I am still learning it." "I know," he said, and turned his hand over to hold hers. "There's no hurry." Thomas was 5 that fall and old enough to start trailing Henry around the ranch with a seriousness of purpose that made Pete grin every time he saw it. The boy had a natural understanding of animals that was something to see. He was not afraid of the cattle, and they seemed to know it, remaining calm around him in the way animals sometimes accept certain people and not others. Henry began teaching him the basics with the patience he brought to every form of instruction, and Lydia watched from the porch sometimes in the mornings, Thomas's small, serious face turned up to his father's, and felt the thing in her chest that she had been carrying since she was 24, the grief and the worry and the managed solitude settle fully, at last, into something that was simply full. Clara, at 2, was an entirely different personality, curious about everything and afraid of nothing, with a gift for finding the most inconvenient possible location to investigate and a laugh that carried across the whole yard. Luther, aged and slow now, had transferred his absolute allegiance to Clara in the way that old dogs sometimes attach themselves to the youngest member of a household, as though recognizing something they need to be near. He followed her at a stately pace wherever she went, and when she sat down anywhere he settled beside her with the same contented sigh he had been producing for years. By the winter of 1888, the ranch was the most stable it had been since Henry took it over at 24. The accounts showed a genuine surplus, the first real operating surplus since the illness that had killed cattle in 1882, and Lydia laid the figures out on the kitchen table in November and showed Henry and said, "You have built something sound here." Henry studied the figures for a long moment. "We have," he said. She looked at the column of numbers. They were clean and honest and carefully arrived at, and she thought of her father's notes in a journal in San Antonio, and the ledgers on a kitchen table in August, and an unsent letter at the back of a thin book, and 40 miles of Texas heat, and a cup of genuinely cold water on a very hot day. "We have," she agreed. On a Sunday in the spring of 1889, they drove the wagon into Barlow Creek for the church service that Lydia had become a regular attendant of, and afterward stood in the churchyard in the bright April air, while Thomas ran with Cal's youngest son, and Clara sat in Henry's arms examining a flower she had found in the grass with total scientific concentration. Clara Whitfield came over and embraced Lydia and talked about the school expansion. Morrison had secured further funding, and there was going to be a second room added to the schoolhouse that fall. And her husband Tom shook Henry's hand and they talked about cattle prices and the new fence wire that was starting to come in from the eastern suppliers. And Pete stood nearby telling a story to Domingo that was making both of them laugh. Lydia stood in the churchyard in the spring morning and looked at all of this. She looked at Henry across the group, holding their daughter and talking to Tom Whitfield, his hat in one hand and Clara investigating the flower in the other. And he looked over at precisely the moment she was looking at him, and he gave her the small private smile that she had first seen at the kitchen table on a November evening, and which she had been receiving for 6 years now, and which she had never once grown accustomed to in the best possible way. She smiled back. Thomas ran past shouting something about a frog, and Clara heard the word and immediately turned toward the sound of it, and Henry had to tighten his grip and say, "Not yet, Clara," and Clara gave him a look that Lydia recognized because she had worn it herself, and Henry saw the recognition on Lydia's face and they both laughed at the same time across the churchyard. It was, she thought, an entirely ordinary morning. The churchyard, the April light, the smell of spring grass and cedar, her children, her friends, her husband's voice and his eyes finding hers across a small group of neighbors. Entirely ordinary and completely unrepeatable, and worth more than any accounting she had ever done. She had ridden out to a ranch in the Texas Hill Country in August of 1882 with fire in her eyes and a leather satchel full of demands, and she had found every ledger ready and one extra page she had not expected, and what was on that page had told her something true about the man who had written it. That was where it had started. It had taken her 40 miles in 6 years, and one clear decision in a San Antonio parlor, and every letter she had sent and received, and one particular afternoon on a river bank, and a marriage in a small church on Commerce Street to arrive here, in this churchyard, on this ordinary Sunday morning. It was, when she added it all up, and she was, after all, a woman who added things up, the best balance she had ever carried forward. Henry came over to her through the small crowd, carrying Clara, who was still studying the flower. He stood beside Lydia and offered her his free arm, which she took, and they stood together in the April morning while their son chased something through the grass with Cal's boy, and the Barlow Creek Sunday went on around them with all the particular richness of a small community in a wide country, full of people building their lives in the same way she and Henry had built theirs. Carefully, honestly, one true thing at a time. "Ready to go home?" Henry asked. "Yes," Lydia said. And they went home. The ranch road was familiar under the wagon wheels, and the hills were green with spring, and Thomas fell asleep between them on the seat before they reached the gate, his head against Lydia's arm, and Clara was asleep against Henry's chest before the house came into view, and the painted bee on the gate post was faded further now, weathered by 7 Texas summers, and Henry had mentioned repainting it in the spring, and Lydia had said she rather liked it as it was. They came up the lane between the hills, and the house was there at the top of it, solid and lit by the late morning sun, and Luther was on the porch lifting his ancient head at the sound of the wagon, and the cattle were in the south pasture, and the cedar on the east fence had bloomed with the thin yellow flowers it always put out in April, and everything was exactly as it should be. Henry helped her down from the wagon, handing Clara to her carefully so as not to wake her, and they carried their sleeping children inside in the Sunday quiet and put them down in their beds and came back to the kitchen. Henry built up the fire. Lydia put the coffee on. Outside the kitchen window, the Texas hill country went on in all directions in the April light, wide and true and entirely itself. She turned from the stove and Henry was right there, in the kitchen, close enough to reach, which she did. She put her hand on his chest and he put his arms around her and they stood in the kitchen in the Sunday quiet, and it was simple and complete and exactly enough. "I rode a very long way to be angry at you," she said. "I know," he said, against her hair. "It turned out to be worth it," she said, his arms tightened. "Yes," he said, "it did." Outside, the spring wind moved through the cedar and the dry grass of the hill country, and somewhere in the south pasture the cattle moved peacefully, and inside the stone and cedar house on the Barlow Ranch, everything was settled and sound, every column balanced, every ledger closed, and every page accounted for.